The tension between individual liberty and collective responsibility is as old as civilization itself. But when our government promises to cover a portion of medical expenses for all citizens over a certain age, does it have the right to restrict their behavior before that age? We examine the intersection between personal choice and public health today on The Professors.
From across the city and the 7 city colleges of Chicago, broadcasting from 63rd and Halsted at Kennedy King College. Professors take the art of conversation to a higher degree.
I'm Ted Williams. Joining me today is Professor Rashid Carter from Olive Harvey College. Rashid, we're talking about public health today. Yeah. And we're talking about whether the government has the responsibility or right, if you will, to regulate what people do when they pay for health care. Now, we know health care is a huge expenditure. We also know that many diseases that people face in this country, like diabetes, heart disease, cancer, which we spend $1.8 trillion on a year, these things are all linked to preventable issues like smoking and obesity. Obesity is a huge problem, as is smoking. We'll talk about that in a second. But in a general sense, where does the government have the right to do these things and to restrict our behavior, if you will, for the sake of public health, and where does that right end?
Yeah, you know, so there is a very hard balance that the government has to maintain, but the thing we have to remember is that the government is an extension of us as citizens. We elect the representatives. Ultimately, we are the ones who elect representatives who are reflective of our personal feelings about various issues, health care choices, or health choices being one of them. So if we're asking where does that line begin and end, for me it's a false dichotomy. I think that there is a continuum that's very dynamic, it's always shifting, and ultimately, the government has a responsibility to look after the well-being of the nation. If it means keeping citizens alive, then of course they want to be in tune to those types of policies that will prompt people to live a better lifestyle. At the same time, though, of course, we are cognizant of the fact that we don't want the government to go too far and infringe upon our personal liberties. Again, where that proper balance lies, I think, is something we're still trying to determine, just as we're still trying to determine what type of free market system is best for us. Is it totally laissez-faire? Is it a command or socialist-based economic system? Or is it somewhere in between? We're still trying to figure out that balance.
The Constitution gives the government the responsibility for promoting the general welfare of its people. That's right. And I have this debate, this conversation all the time, like, what does that mean? When we talk about health care, when we talk about social welfare, all those areas, and you obviously have conservatives who would argue that general welfare is probably restricted to making sure we don't get killed by terrorists.
Of course.
And maybe that, you know, if you have a fire or something like that, they'll come and put that out. But then liberals obviously would go to the other extreme and argue that the government then should be involved in regulating all kinds of things. Like, I read an article recently about a school district that will not allow parents to send their own lunch for the children. I mean, this is crazy.
I read the same article, absolutely.
Absolutely crazy.
Absolutely. But what did the kids say? I read the article, and of course, you know, the principal is there, and they have the administrators maintaining a proper environment in the lunchroom to make sure that students aren't bringing their own stuff. But what do students do? They sneak in their own stuff, or they say, I'm not going to eat the lunch you provide, I'll just wait till after school, and then I'm going to eat what I want to eat anyway. And so that's really the issue. The government can regulate all they want, but people are going to do what they want to do.
Okay, but why in this case, just for our audience, why are they even regulating it in the first place?
Right, because of course we know that too many times young people make bad choices when it comes to feeding themselves. And so even when parents decide to give them you know, a nice meat sandwich and maybe some fruit and vegetables, the kid is going to go and take their dollar and go to the local bodega or the corner store and buy the flaming hot potato chips, some variant of Kool-Aid, and something that's just bad for them in general, right?
Absolutely.
And so ultimately, again, what that says to me is it's not an issue about a regulation, it's about household choices.
Okay.
You know, how we promptly behave.
Okay, but you know, obesity is a huge issue, right? You know, the economists, which you are yourself here, predict that obesity-related diseases will cost the country $344 billion by 2018. And that literally in 10 years, pretty much close to half of all Americans will be obese.
Right.
So you got the kid that comes to school with his food, or, I mean, truthfully, the kid could come with food that the parent gave them that may not be all that healthy, according to the school.
Very good.
But we have to really stop and ask ourselves the question, does the government have the right or responsibility to even step in when that is the case? Because I think that's what people are reacting to. I mean, it's like, I cannot imagine sending my kids to school and having the school district tell them what I'm sending them to eat is not good enough for them to eat.
That's right.
And I think that's where a lot of people are really getting upset about issues like this.
There's some people who are getting upset. There are people who are prompting the issue. There are individuals, there are organizations that are concerned about obesity and that are influencing these policy decisions. It's not as if there's the government versus the people. To frame the disconnect that way, I think is a little bit misleading. Again, what we essentially have is various groups of people with various perspectives on what role government should play in terms of steering our behaviors. And for me, you asked the question earlier about what role government should take in looking out for our general welfare. Let's take the logical extreme and consider it. If we all smoked and ate and did everything we wanted to do without proper curbs of any kind, then what if there was no people in America in the future? What if our population retracted to the extent that we didn't have enough of a populace to support the America that we know?
Right.
That's something we have to consider as well. And I think that's something the government is worried about.
Well, but but the real issue here, I think, is not necessarily that people are wanting these regulations, because whether they want to or not, they do not have the authority, the arm that the government has to actually enforce them. So what we really are looking at is the role of the government in this. I mean, I can want the government, for instance, to make sure that all kids, read their political science textbook every day, read the Constitution every day.
Right.
And if I can want that all I want to, if I don't have the government's arm of enforcement, then this is very limited. So I think we are talking about that, but I would ask the question of you, do you think as an economist that the government's mandating of behaviors really influences people's behaviors very much?
Yeah, okay, so I would say that it can.
Okay.
And I would say that it does. I mean, for instance, just last night, I'm a big basketball fan.
Okay.
And I was watching the playoffs, and in the middle of a intermission, I saw a commercial with Michelle Obama with the basketball, basically telling people to go out and play some ball.
I
right?
saw the same one.
Okay. So that of course that commercial was funded by the government, and it's not telling anybody they have to go out and play basketball. It's simply telling a message of being active.
Gotcha.
Even though you're watching this game, at some point get up and exercise your body so that you don't grow into the couch and have health issues down the road. I think that's a very easy and measured way that the government can attempt to influence behavior without being too heavy-handed.
Okay.
So I think there is, in some instances, you don't
because there are programs about fatherhood, that sort of thing.
All kinds of things like that, right?
Advertisement,
So you do want to prompt, some type of behavior modification that we know ultimately is going to be in the best interest of kids or people in general. But we also have to consider this: who's pushing back against this desire to have a more fit America? I wouldn't think that the average American is pushing back. I would think that lobbyists for the big companies, the McDonald's, the Burger Kings, the people who are making a lot of money off of these bad lifestyle choices are the ones who are pushing back the most, and the data definitely supports that. So ultimately, we have, and if you look at the history of public policy as it pertains to creating proper health choices, that's been the legacy of public policy in this country, right? Where you have a policy created or steered by certain private interests so that those private interests can make a little bit more money, can have a bigger market share at the expense of the social good. And that's the sort of contention that's always been there.
And maybe what can happen, because you're very right in all that you're saying, maybe what can happen also is that the other entities within our culture can play a role. Like, for instance, the film Super Size Me is a good example of this. So McDonald's, as we all know, has come out with these really healthy choices in terms of salads and that sort of thing.
That's right.
And truthfully, many people believe that was very heavily prompted by the negative attention that they got from the film Super Size Me.
Right.
So there are ways, around it. There are other ways besides the government, but I've always argued that because the government has such a strong hand, such an overarching influence in our culture, that they their role is one that we really have to think about, be careful with, but we do need to use it when necessary. And there are a lot of issues, which I'm sure we'll get into as well, in terms of how they do this with public health.
Yeah, and we have to keep something in mind as well, and this is something, again, that really gave rise to the predominance of the FDA in steering these sort of policies, and that is this whole notion of information asymmetry. The fact that to talk about, the people having certain information about how to lead proper, lifestyle choices, and then private interests having the same information, and then people making good, responsible decisions, that's a bit of a misnomer, because ultimately what we know and what history has demonstrated is that people, by and large, don't have full information, which is why we're still taking baby steps and simply telling the big fast food chains and food producers of all kinds to simply let people know what's in those food products, right? And so ultimately, I think what the government is attempting to do is level the playing field.
Okay, but so say we let people know, like the Surgeon General's warning on cigarette smoking, and that doesn't have the desired effect. So we go further. We ban smoking advertisement. We look at ways to make it less appealing. We look at efforts to make sure that smoking and cigarettes are not being advertised to children.
Correct.
So this is what obviously many people are, and I would argue that the only people arguing for cigarettes are probably the tobacco industry.
Of course.
But the question for you is, and I would answer this with cigarettes, it has had an impact. I mean, the number of people smoking has gone down with the public health campaigns.
Absolutely.
But do you think that would happen with fast food? Do you think it would happen with, say, cell phone usage and driving and texting while driving, which is a huge issue?
Sure.
Do you think the government can have the same impact that it's had in the issue of smoking?
I think in time they can. I mean, the issue with smoking, it didn't take place right away. It's been several decades in the offing that this effect has finally taken hold. And the government has been the lead. But what we also saw is that the government has taken the lead, but you had, of course, certain private interests that were also very important to this. I mean, for instance, it's taboo in Hollywood to smoke in public spheres. That's just not something that Hollywood stars think is very sexy. Whereas once upon a time,
which is very different than
once upon a time, where that was the standard of sex appeal, was have a cigarette in your mouth for a man or a woman. So again, I think that the government has a role in terms of suggesting or prompting certain lifestyle changes. But at the end of the day, we don't want the government to necessarily be in our bedrooms, in our minds, making decisions for us. And I would also say that when we talk about cigarettes or even the foods, the trans fats, they all can be addictive to some extent. To the extent that these,
because if they have trans fat bans now, I know New York was debating one for a very long time.
That's correct.
And because of this obesity issue.
That's right. And you have people who are, for lack of a better term, addicted to those types of food choices. Just as people are addicted to cigarettes. And so even though you can put those curbs in place as in a form of policy, at the end of the day, people are going to find a way to get what they want to get anyway.
So maybe it's an issue of providing incentives for the right behavior and discouragement for bad behavior.
That's exactly it.
And maybe it's not just an issue of regulation. The government has a variety of tools it can use to influence behavior.
That's right.
I think about my students and we have the legalization of marijuana debate very often.
That's right.
And, as you can imagine, in a college setting, you always have a group of vocal supporters for the legalization of marijuana.
Of course.
And I always argue with them and actually make the case, as we, have these informal debates, that regulation of activities does very heavily decrease its usage. Now, people are going to smoke marijuana. They're going to use drugs. They're going to drink. But when we make it easy for them, right? When there are, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to understand that a lot of McDonald's in a community means that people are going to eat hamburgers.
True.
And so if marijuana, something like marijuana, is very available, then it's going to cause people to potentially have more access and then use it. Dr. King said that you cannot legislate morality, but you can regulate behavior.
Sure.
And I think that is a very important quote in this debate.